The Roaring Twenties, that glittering decade of jazz, flappers, and unprecedented prosperity that Americans remember with such nostalgic fondness, wasn't actually the triumph of capitalism and progress that we've been taught to celebrate. It was a carefully constructed house of cards built on systemic flaws, reckless speculation, and fundamental economic imbalances that made collapse not just possible, but inevitable. And to understand why this decade was designed to fail from the very beginning, we need to look beyond the champagne towers and Charleston dancers to see the rot festering beneath the glamorous surface. The story really begins in 1918, when World War I finally ended and America emerged as the world's dominant economic power. Unlike the European nations that had bankrupted themselves fighting on their own soil, the United States had profited enormously from the war. American factories had supplied the Allies with weapons, food, and materials. American banks had financed the war effort through massive loans. And American casualties, while significant, were a fraction of what Britain, France, and Germany had suffered. So when the guns fell silent, America was positioned to dominate global trade in a way no nation had before. But this advantageous position came with responsibilities and complexities that American policymakers were either unwilling or unable to manage properly, setting the stage for the disaster that would unfold a decade later. One of the first and most consequential mistakes came in how America handled war debts and reparations. The European allies owed the United States over $10 billion, an astronomical sum that they had no realistic way to repay, given that their economies were shattered and their populations exhausted. The sensible thing would have been to forgive much of this debt, or at least restructure it generously, allowing European nations to rebuild and creating trading partners who could buy American goods. But American politicians, responding to public sentiment that demanded repayment, insisted that the debts be honored in full. They hired the money, didn't they? President Coolidge supposedly remarked with characteristic terseness, this stubborn insistence on full repayment created a cascading series of problems, because the only way the Allies could repay America was by extracting reparations from defeated Germany, which they did through the punitive Treaty of Versailles. But Germany couldn't pay these crushing reparations without borrowing money, which they did primarily from American banks. So American money flowed to Germany, which used it to pay reparations to Britain and France, which used it to pay war debts to America, creating a circular flow that only worked as long as American banks kept lending. The moment that lending stopped, the entire system would collapse like a Jenga tower with its crucial supporting pieces removed. Meanwhile, American domestic policy was being shaped by a philosophy that we might generously call laissez-faire capitalism, or more accurately describe as letting wealthy interests write their own rules. The three Republican presidents of the 1920s, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, all believed that government's role was to get out of the way and let business boom. Taxes on the wealthy were slashed dramatically, from a top rate of 73% in 1921 down to 25% by 1925, the logic being that this would free up capital for investment and the benefits would trickle down to everyone. Regulations on banks and corporations were relaxed or simply not enforced. Antitrust laws were ignored as massive consolidations created oligopolies in industry after industry. And the prevailing attitude in Washington was that businessmen knew best and that any attempt to restrain their activities would only hamper prosperity. This hands-off approach might have worked if American capitalism had been populated by responsible stewards thinking about long-term stability, but instead it created a playground for speculators, fraudsters, and short-term thinkers who were happy to pump up profits today, even if it meant disaster tomorrow. The stock market became the most visible symbol of 20s excess and the clearest example of systemic design flaws. In 1920, the total value of stocks traded on the New York Stock Exchange was around $27 billion. By 1929, it had exploded to $87 billion, a more than threefold increase in less than a decade. And this wasn't driven by a corresponding increase in actual business productivity or profits. It was driven by speculation, by people buying stocks not because they believed in the underlying companies, but because they expected prices to keep rising. And here's where the structural problems become glaringly obvious. Because the system allowed and even encouraged practices that were essentially legalized gambling with borrowed money. You could buy stocks on margin, meaning you only had to put down 10 or 20% of the purchase price and borrow the rest from your broker. So if you had $1,000, you could control $5,000 or even $10,000 worth of stock, and as long as prices kept rising, this leverage made you rich very quickly. But the moment prices fell, you'd get a margin call demanding you put up more cash or your stocks would be sold at a loss, creating a vicious cycle where falling prices forced more selling, which caused prices to fall further. Banks weren't just enabling this speculation, they were active participants. Commercial banks that held ordinary people's deposits were using that money to speculate in stocks, creating loans to stockbrokers, and investing directly in the market themselves. There was no separation between boring traditional banking and risky investment banking, no firewall protecting depositors' money from speculation, and regulatory oversight was essentially non-existent. The Federal Reserve, which had been created in 1913 partly to prevent financial panics, was led by people who believed intervention was inappropriate, that markets should be allowed to find their own level. So even as warning signs multiplied, even as stock prices detached completely from rational valuations, the Fed did nothing meaningful to cool the speculation. Occasionally, they'd issue statements expressing concern, but they wouldn't actually use their tools to rein in the excess. It was like watching a car speed toward a cliff and limiting yourself to saying, that seems inadvisable, while refusing to touch the brakes. The agricultural sector reveals another fundamental flaw in the 20s economy. While urban Americans were enjoying unprecedented prosperity, rural America was struggling through what amounted to a decade-long depression. During World War I, farmers had expanded production dramatically to feed European populations and had borrowed heavily to buy more land and equipment. But when European agriculture recovered after the war, American farmers found themselves producing far more than they could sell. Wheat prices collapsed from $2.19 per bushel in 1919 to under $1 by 1922. Farmers who had borrowed to expand couldn't pay their debts. Rural banks failed by the hundreds. And a huge segment of the population that had been relatively prosperous before the war now struggled with poverty. But policymakers in Washington, focused on the booming cities and the stock market, largely ignored this crisis. Occasional relief measures were proposed, but usually vetoed or watered down. The assumption seemed to be that agriculture was a declining sector anyway, and that displaced farmers would eventually move to cities and find work in factories. What this meant in practice was that roughly a third of Americans were already in depression before 1929, not participating in the prosperity, not buying the consumer goods that factories were producing in ever greater quantities, creating a fundamental imbalance between production capacity and consumption that would prove catastrophic. Income inequality reached levels that wouldn't be seen again until our own era. In 1929, the top 1% of Americans owned 40% of the nation's wealth. The bottom 93% experienced essentially no increase in their real incomes during the entire decade despite massive productivity gains. And this wasn't an accident or an unfortunate side effect. It was the intended result of policy choices: low taxes on the wealthy, weak unions, no minimum wage, no unemployment insurance, no social safety net of any kind. All the gains from increased productivity flowed to capital rather than labor, to shareholders and executives rather than workers. And while the rich spent lavishly on luxury goods and speculated in stocks, they couldn't possibly consume enough to absorb all the goods that American factories were producing. Meanwhile, the workers who were actually producing those goods couldn't afford to buy them, creating a fundamental contradiction at the heart of the economy. You had optimized a system for production but hadn't ensured sufficient consumption. It was like building a massive engine without considering whether you had enough fuel to run it. The decade also saw the rise of consumer debt on a scale never before seen. Before the 20s, most Americans saved up to buy things. Going into debt was considered shameful and was reserved for major purchases like homes or farms. But during the 20s, installment buying became normalized and even celebrated. You could buy a car, a radio, furniture, even clothes on credit, paying a small amount down and the rest in monthly installments. This allowed people to consume beyond their means and helped sustain the boom. But it also created massive systemic fragility because all those purchases were based on the assumption of continued employment and income. The moment that assumption proved false, the moment people started losing their jobs, they would default on their debts, stop buying on installment, and the whole consumption engine would seize up. It was another case of short-term thinking, of goosing current demand by borrowing from the future without considering what would happen when the future arrived and the bills came due. The banking system itself was a disaster waiting to happen. The United States had thousands of small, undercapitalized banks, unlike other industrialized nations that had a few large, stable banks. American banking was fragmented and weak. Most banks operated in a single location and couldn't diversify their risk geographically. So a bank in a farming community was completely exposed to agricultural problems. A bank in a factory town was completely exposed to that industry's fortunes. And there was no deposit insurance. If your bank failed, you lost everything. This meant that banking panics could become self-fulfilling prophecies. If rumors spread that a bank was in trouble, depositors would rush to withdraw their money, forcing the bank to liquidate assets at fire sale prices, turning rumors into reality. And because banks were interconnected through correspondent relationships, one bank's failure could trigger a cascade. Yet throughout the 20s, as hundreds of rural banks failed, as warning signs multiplied, policymakers did essentially nothing to strengthen the system. The prevailing ideology was that weak banks should be allowed to fail, that this was creative destruction, that intervention would only reward incompetence. International trade policy added another layer of dysfunction. In 1922, Congress passed the Ford-Niemecumber tariff, raising import duties to protect American industries. Then in 1930, even after the crash, they passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff, raising rates even higher. The logic was that protecting American businesses and workers from foreign competition would preserve prosperity. But this ignored basic economics. If America wouldn't import goods from other countries, those countries couldn't earn dollars to buy American exports or repay their debts. European nations retaliated with their own tariffs, international trade collapsed, and the global economy fragmented into competing blocs, making recovery far harder. It was another case of policymakers optimizing for one variable, protection of domestic industries, while ignoring the systemic consequences, not understanding or not caring that in an interconnected global economy, you can't wall yourself off without triggering retaliation and making everyone worse off. The Federal Reserve's monetary policy throughout the decade oscillated between inadequate and actively harmful. In the early 20s, they kept interest rates too high, contributing to the agricultural depression and the recession of 1920 to 21. Then in the mid-20s, they kept rates too low, fueling the stock market speculation. Then, as the bubble grew obvious, they raised rates in 1928 and 1929, but not enough to cool speculation and just enough to hurt legitimate businesses. And then after the crash, they raised rates again and allowed the money supply to contract dramatically, turning what might have been a normal recession into the Great Depression. At every crucial juncture, they made the wrong choice. And this wasn't because the people running the Fed were stupid. They were intelligent and well-meaning. But they were operating under a flawed ideology that said central banks should barely intervene, that they should let markets work, that attempting to manage the economy was futile and probably harmful. It was like having a fire department that believed firefighting was counterproductive and that fires should be allowed to burn themselves out naturally. Perhaps most fundamentally, the entire political and economic elite of the 1920s subscribed to a worldview that made the crash inevitable. They believed that economic growth could continue indefinitely without interruption, that the business cycle had been conquered, that America had entered a new era of permanent prosperity. We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. Herbert Hoover declared in 1928, less than a year before the crash. This wasn't just optimism. It was a quasi-religious faith that blinded people to warning signs. When economists pointed out unsustainable debt levels, they were dismissed as pessimists. When analysts noted that stock prices had no relation to actual earnings, they were told that old metrics didn't apply to the new economy. When observers worried about inequality and underconsumption, they were accused of class warfare. It was a collective delusion enforced by the fact that questioning it marked you as unserious, as not understanding the modern world, as bitter about other people's success. The technological changes of the era, while real and significant, were misunderstood and oversold. Yes, electrification, automobiles, radio, and other innovations were transforming American life, but the economic elite assumed that technology automatically translated into prosperity for everyone. They didn't consider that technology could destroy jobs faster than it created them, that productivity gains could accrue entirely to capital rather than being shared with labor, that new industries might not employ as many people as the old industries they displaced. So you had a situation where productivity was soaring, where America could produce more goods with fewer workers. But nobody had seriously thought about what happens in an economy where production is efficient but consumption is constrained because workers don't have enough income. It was a problem of distribution, not production. But the ideology of the time couldn't even see it as a problem. The assumption was that if production was efficient, everything else would somehow work itself out. Corporate fraud and manipulation were rampant and essentially unpunished. The era of the robber barons supposedly ended before World War I. But the 1920s saw plenty of their spiritual descendants, stock pools where groups of wealthy insiders would coordinate to manipulate stock prices. Insider trading was legal and common. Accounting standards were lax to non-existent, so companies could report whatever numbers they wanted. Pyramid schemes and Ponzi schemes proliferated, the most famous being Charles Ponzi himself, whose scheme collapsed in 1920 but whose techniques were copied throughout the decade. And regulatory agencies that might have cracked down on this behavior were understaffed, underfunded, and led by people who didn't believe in regulation. It was the fox guarding the henhouse, except the fox didn't believe henhouses should have guards in the first place. The international dimension of the decade's instability can't be overstated. World War I had destroyed the old economic order based on the gold standard and British financial dominance. But nothing stable replaced it. America had the economic power to be the new hegemon, but refused to accept the responsibilities that came with that role. Britain tried to return to its pre-war position, but lacked the resources. The result was a system where nobody was in charge, where problems festered without resolution, where the circular flow of war debts and reparations created constant crises, where currencies fluctuated wildly, where nations pursued beggar-thy-neighbor policies, trying to export their way to prosperity at others' expense. It was a multipolar world without rules or leadership, which might sound good in theory, but in practice meant that small problems could spiral into catastrophes because there was no mechanism for coordination or resolution, and American policymakers, drunk on their own prosperity and convinced of their superiority, refused to even acknowledge that these international imbalances were their problem. They thought they could isolate America from global instability through tariffs and restrictive immigration policies, not understanding that in an interconnected world, you can't have it both ways. You can't be the world's largest creditor and largest exporter while refusing to import or forgive debts. Looking back from our vantage point nearly a century later, what's striking about the Roaring Twenties isn't just that they ended badly. It's how obviously they were going to end badly. How many people at the time pointed out the problems? How many warning signs were ignored? How many times policymakers had opportunities to correct course and chose not to? It wasn't a random accident or unforeseeable catastrophe. It was the logical consequence of a system designed by and for short-term thinkers, who prioritized current profits over long-term stability, who believed that markets were self-correcting and that inequality didn't matter, who confused a stock market bubble with genuine prosperity, who thought that you could have permanent boom without bust if you just believed hard enough. And when the inevitable crash came in October 1929, when the house of cards finally collapsed, the same people who had created the fragility were shocked, genuinely shocked. They hadn't seen it coming, because they had convinced themselves it couldn't happen. And then they spent years making the depression worse through austerity policies and gold standard orthodoxy, because they still didn't understand that the problem wasn't a temporary liquidity crisis. It was fundamental flaws in how the economy had been structured. The Roaring Twenties failed not because of bad luck or unforeseeable events, but because they were designed to fail. Because every major policy choice of the decade prioritized speculation over stability, short-term gain over long-term sustainability, the interests of capital over the needs of labor, and individual freedom for the wealthy over collective responsibility. It was a decade built on the assumption that if you just let the rich get richer, somehow everyone would benefit. And when that assumption proved catastrophically wrong, the cost was paid not by the architects of the system, but by ordinary Americans who lost their jobs, their savings, their homes. Their hope, who lived through a decade of depression that might have been avoided if the previous decade had been built on more solid foundations. And the tragedy is that we keep learning and forgetting this same lesson. Keep building prosperity on debt and speculation and inequality. Keep assuming that this time is different, that we've figured out how to make it sustainable. Right up until the moment when we discover once again that systems designed with fundamental flaws will inevitably fail, no matter how much we wish otherwise.